Hi. In this lecture, I would like to say a few things that will add to some of the ideas presented in the last lecture, and also try to sort of give us a bridge into our next theme, which will be technology. So to begin with, just by way of recapitulation, in the last lecture, I suggested that parables, like Plato's parable of the cave, for example, they function in a number of different ways, and one of them is by giving a sort of imagine a body or a shape or a form or an image to something that in itself doesn't have a shape or a form or an image. And in the case of Plato's Cave, we had the example of basically the process of gaining knowledge. It's very difficult for us to just immediately reflect upon that process in ourselves. Somehow, when we have this parable before us, we are confronted by way of an analogy or a sort of an imaginal depiction. We're confronted with this process that we ordinarily would overscape us because it's happening behind our eyes, so to speak. And again, the process itself, the process of learning or attaining to the truth, winning through to the truth, that doesn't really look like anything. It doesn't have a shape. It's very similar to if we think of an idea or a concept like liberty or love or even something like roundness, the quality of roundness. We say that a circle is round, or a cup maybe is round viewed from the top, but roundness itself can't be round because roundness is what it is to be that. And so somehow we can describe roundness by giving the example of a circle, but it's only the meaning has to be grasped through the object or through the image, and the image by itself, if we arrest that process at the image itself, we haven't really won through to the meaning of that image or the truth in this case. So again, concepts like or I don't know what to call them, concepts, ideas, principles, like liberty, roundness, like love, all of these concepts, not to mention the concept of our own intelligence or the principle of our own intelligence. None of these things looks like anything exactly in itself. But so instead, and then in the case of intelligence, for example, by way of Plato's parable of the cave, we're in some ways given a way that it can look, basically for our own, but again, if we imagine that we've understood the parable of the cave because we know what happens in it, that's not sufficient. That might be a necessary condition for us to understand the meaning or the import or the significance of the parable, but that by itself, it's not the same thing as understanding the parable. Again, this is all sort of by way of recapitulation of ideas that have been presented in the last two lectures. Again, we've asked the question, what does it really mean to understand something? And clearly it's more than just being able to repeat the words, so to speak. It's more than just sort of having access to the data or to the facts. This is obvious to us, and if it were no more than that, if understanding were no more than having access to data or to information, then we certainly wouldn't have, education would have in some ways come to an end with the advent of the smartphone, and everyone who ever owned a smartphone would be more or less enlightened. And a library, for example, or with all these books, a library would be would contain more wisdom, or would be wiser, would have greater understanding. A library would have greater understanding than any one of its patrons. Clearly, there's something wrong about that. We don't generally think of even a book. A book itself is not intelligent. It's like the book is in some ways, the book serves as almost like a mirror for the reader, for our own understanding. If we think about this a little bit and critically reflect on it, we can realize that it's impossible really to read anything more in a book than I'm able to understand in that book. And so in some ways, I'm the words themselves, they serve as a sort of reflection or a mirror for my own knowledge or my own understanding. And so again, we have to think of the process of learning or of understanding as something much more than just assembling and aggregating facts and aggregating information, aggregating data. That might be part of it, but again, that's not all of it. So understanding has something to do with our activity of basically discerning meaning in those facts or interpreting those facts in a meaningful way. We also, in the last lecture, just considered one principle of learning or of understanding that Plato's parable of the cave illuminates and presents in very sharp relief for us, is the way that, in some way, presumption of knowledge can arrest the process of learning right at the very outset. So, in some ways, the greatest enemy of learning is knowledge in some way, or it's knowledge that we presume to have. If I think that I already know something, I will be disinclined, to say the least, to go and seek to understand it further. I will sort of, again, I will develop a sort of complacent attitude towards the thing, and again assume that I've already basically understood what there is to know about it. We can think of, in some way, the figures, just to recall the parable of the cave, the figures in the characters in the bottom who are confronted with the shadows in the bottom of the cave. In some way, what their condition, the condition that Plato's parable of the cave is depicting, it's very akin to dreaming, dreaming as though as we do in sleep. In fact, in some way, it is dreaming. And what I mean by that is when we're dreaming, for example, I'll just try to show why I think they're the same thing. When we're dreaming, we are unaware of and not inclined to inquire into the causes of our perceptions. So in a dream, for example, if I'm dreaming that, suppose that I'm dreaming that my room is on fire, my house is on fire. I have an experience in the dream that, right, so the walls around me are going up in flames, for example. When I awaken from that dream, within the context of the dream, it makes sense to for example, try to put out the fire, right? Or maybe seek for the cause of the fire, seek for the arson, but that's within the dream. The minute that I awake from the dream, all of those courses of action, they don't make any sense, because from outside of the dream, I'll be much more inclined not to try to put out the fire, or not to seek for whoever started the fire, the arson. But instead I will be inclined to maybe the bedclothes were too much, and the room is too hot. Suppose the furnace is too hot, something like that. What I guess I'm implying is that through awakening, in contrast to being in the condition of a dream, the condition of awakening is it's exactly the same thing as becoming aware, becoming cognizant of the true causes of something. Within the dream, we're perceiving only effects. I haven't really understood those effects until I have correlated them to their respective causes. Within a dream, this can only be accomplished upon awakening from that dream, or achieving some degree of wakefulness, even within the dream. By analogy, within Plato's parable of the cave, what keeps the characters in the bottom of the cave complacent is because it doesn't occur to them to try to correlate their visions or their perceptions, though it doesn't occur to them to correlate those effects with their true causes. They're content and complacent with entertaining the illusion that those effects explain themselves, which the parable clearly depicts that, in fact, they do not explain themselves. Within the parable, awakening is symbolized by this ascent out of the cave and increasing exposure to the incident source of light, which in the parable is depicted in the form of the sun. We can think, though, generally speaking, while while naive thinking or ordinary thinking, where we just ordinary perception, where we again we're content with establishing relationships amongst effects. When we the kind of critical shift or the critical reversal means it's akin to, and in fact it's identical with a degree of awakening from ordinary thinking or naive thinking. Critical thinking is a higher level of, it entails a wakefulness. It entails awakening in respect to ordinary thinking. And so I think this is somewhat, everything so far has been somewhat by way of recapitulation, but I think it's also, I hope that just saying it in a little bit different way, it might serve to illuminate different aspects and maybe spark new insights. I'll just, I would like to also, in this lecture, and I'm going to proceed to do this in a moment, is to present another very short parable. And this is by way of, well, without losing connection with what we've established in the first two lectures, just in respect to our inquiry into critical thinking and also how to make use of and how to understand parables and analogical language. I'm going to present another parable that will serve, besides that, to also introduce us or serve as a sort of entry point into our next theme, which will be technology. Before I do that, though, I do have a quote, a very relevant quote from Plato, just in respect to the notion of dreaming versus awakening, or sleeping versus awakening, and the idea that in fact critical thinking or philosophical thinking is a form of awakening. And this is from Platos Republic, which is the same, obviously the same book from which the parable of the cave itself was extracted. He describes philosophy. He says, turning a soul from day that is a kind of night. So day, we can imagine being asleep and dreaming that it was broad daylight, dreaming that it was high noon when in fact we were just fast asleep. Plato says, turning a soul from day that is a kind of night to true day. We can imagine awakening in the true day in contrast to dreaming that it's day. The ascent, again, he's using this image of ascending to a form of wakefulness that's familiar to us from the parable of the cave. He says, turning a soul from day that is a kind of night to true day. The ascent to what is, which we say is true philosophy. So the ascent to what is rather than to what the ascent to what is from what seems. That we say, says Plato, is true philosophy. And so clearly we're using the way that Plato thinks of philosophy. Philosophy has come to mean many different things in our time. But for Plato, I think it can be very clear to us that philosophy is essentially related. What we're studying with critical thinking is closely related to what Plato and Socrates have in mind with philosophy. The name philosophy, it gives us a picture of striving or yearning for or aspiring towards a loving wisdom. Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom, and philo means a sort of love of or affinity for, or striving towards. So philosophy means a sort of approach or again love for wisdom. And so now I'll again trying to maintain a connection with all of these with this view of parables and this view of what a critical thinking can mean. I'll just present this rather short. Again, it's a sort of myth or a parable that Socrates offers. Again, it's Plato writing, and Socrates is the protagonist in Plato's dialogues. And this again, it's a sort of it's a symbol of technology, and I'll just read this short passage it's from Plato's. The dialogue is called Phaedrus, and so we've read sections from the Republic, and we've read a section from the Apology. This is a third dialogue. It's called the Phaedrus dialogue. I'll just read the short excerpt, and then just say a few notes about what I think this can sort of leave us with a few questions or prompts that my hope is that the questions and prompts will serve to basically stimulate further thoughts and maybe they'll be like seeds for our discussion, and over time if we tend them, then they can flourish in some way for us And so again, this is a passage from Plato's Phaedrus, and it describes basically the moment that this sort of mythical scene in which the gods granted the knowledge of letters or writing to, in this case, the Egyptians. The Greeks looked to the Egyptians as sort of as their forefathers in some ways, especially in respect to philosophy and knowledge. So Socrates says, and this is Plato writing, Socrates says, "It would take a long time to repeat all that Thamus told to Thoth in praise or blame of the various arts." So these are various arts, and they settle on writing or letters. But when they came to letters, "This," said Thoth, "will make the Egyptians wiser and give them better memories." So it will increase their wisdom and their faculty of memory, their faculty of recollection. It is specific both for memory and for the wit. So for wit and wisdom, and also for the memory. So again, he's referring to the art of letters or the art of writing. Thaumas replies to Thoth. He says, "Oh, most ingenious Thoth, the parent or inventor of an art is not always the best judge of the utility or inutility of his own inventions to the users of those inventions. And in this instance, you, who are the father of letters, from a paternal love of your own children, have been led to attribute to them a quality which they cannot have. For this discovery of yours will create forgetfulness in the learner's souls, not memory. Because they will cease to use their memories. They will trust to the external written characters and not remember themselves and their own ability to remember. The specific art which you have discovered is an aid not to memory, but to reminiscence, and you give your disciples not truth, but only the semblance of truth. They will be hearers of many things, and yet they will have learned nothing. They will appear to be omniscient, and will generally know very little. They will be tiresome company, moreover, having the show of wisdom without the reality of it." So again, this is a scene, a sort of mythical scene depicting a god who confers the art of writing to ancient humans in Egypt. And we can, if we just sort of, again, having received the sort of factual account of the parable, now it's incumbent on us to try to, in some ways, try to inquire into what this account might signify, like what might be its meaning. And so I'd just like to leave us with a few suggestions that I hope we can continue to develop them and to unfold them and explore them. The first thing that I would just note is that in some ways Plato here is giving us an image of an externalization and a magnification of a faculty or capacity that is already in some ways innate to us. In this case, it's both wisdom and memory. I think the connection will be clear to us here. Just the simple task of, or the simple act of writing a list of tasks that one has to accomplish, for example. This serves, it sort of frees our minds because we no longer have to remember those tasks. We have committed them to writing. And then, in some extended use of the word, the list, the writing itself, the letters, they take over our responsibility for having to remember them. And so again, it's a sort of externalization, or outsourcing, even we could think of it. We're sort of outsourcing abilities or jobs that we might otherwise have to accomplish from within ourselves inwardly. So through technology, we outsource facets of our own selves, and I mean ourselves that include both the body and also the mind or the soul. And so in the case of memory, for example, it's not clear that clearly we're not just taking a part of our brain and putting it on the paper, but we are taking a capacity of our minds or our souls and basically, again, outsourcing it to the paper, to the writing. So I said externalization of these capacities, and I would also just like to emphasize the fact that they are in some ways magnified or intensified. So it's externalized and also magnified. And what I mean by this is, well, just to go back to the example of a library from earlier in this lecture, it's clear that despite so ancient people, displayed extraordinary prowess of memory, and like the Vedic sages in India would remember hundreds of thousands of verses in the Upanishads and the Vedas. It's clear that in Homer, for example, the ancient Greek bard, he would recite the Iliad and the Odyssey. Both are originally oral tradition. They were recited without committing them to writing. It's very difficult for us modern people to accomplish these kind of feats of memory today. But nevertheless, the Odyssey and the Iliad both can be contained, within a couple square inches on a bookshelf. So it's clear that in some ways, this capacity of memory, it's both externalized and also magnified, right? Because if you use those few inches of a bookshelf for those two books, you have the whole rest of the bookshelf for 1,000 other things. Yeah. So there's a clear advantage in that case. But I think this scene from Plato is very useful because it also shows us what we might be missing, because we sort of what we might be sacrificing. We fixate on the benefits of the technology, and we might overlook, in the way that Plato described, we might overlook the cost by which those benefits are won. Perhaps it's a telling example if we think of, and this I hope can lead us into a further discussion. But there's another very famous mythic scene that in fact one can also encounter this scene in Plato's writing. I believe it's in the Protagoras dialogue, is when Socrates gives the account of the myth of it's either Socrates or it might be Protagoras himself. I can't remember at this point, but in any case, the dialogue, I think it is Protagoras. He tells the myth of Prometheus and Epimetheus, the two brothers who were responsible for basically bestowing the creatures of the earth with various gifts. The myth is famous because the Prometheus, again in this memorable scene, he steals fire from the gods and gives it to the human beings. One way we can, in fact, and by analogy, and I hope this is something we can explore over the next week, in some way, fire itself, it can also be a symbol of technology. And because it's a symbol of technology, it will help us, once we understand the symbol of fire, it will illuminate some aspects of technology for us that otherwise we might overlook. And so these are just a couple sort of suggestions that I hope can, again, spark further thoughts for us. But on that note, I think that this is a good place to end the lecture, and I look forward to carrying on these thoughts and these conversations at a later time. So best wishes to everyone.